This month's book is When Money Dies by Adam Fergusson. It's a fascinating but sad story about how the German currency, the mark, became virtually worthless after World War I. And allow me to illustrate what I mean in two ways. One is in the context of the cost of a product, let's say a loaf of bread. And be prepared, whenever a loaf of bread is used as an example, it's usually not a happy story. Okay, in 1914, a loaf of bread would set you back 0.13 marks. In November of 2023, a similar loaf of bread would cost you 200 billion marks. Another way to look at it is in foreign currency terms. In 1914, it took just 4 German marks to buy 1 US dollar. By late 1923, it took 4.2 trillion marks to buy 1 US dollar, just a total collapse of the mark. How could this have happened? Well, after World War I, Germany was overwhelmed by war debts and reparations bills. And instead of solving these problems through spending restraint and taxation, the government increasingly just financed itself by creating more money, more currency. It's a classic case of money printing gone wild. At first, inflation seemed manageable, then it accelerated, and eventually it spiraled completely out of control. As I read this book, I figured the biggest takeaway for my audience would be the answer to this two-part question. Who were the winners and losers, and what can we learn from them? Well, first, the losers. Pretty much every German was a loser, but the biggest losers were the people who held fixed claims or were receiving fixed amounts denominated in marks. So, for example, savers with large cash balances, retirees living on fixed pensions, bondholders and lenders, and people with salaries that were more or less fixed. So, in other words, the people who suffered the most were the people who depended on the stability of money itself. So, were there any winners? And this is where the story gets interesting. There were few absolute winners. Germany as a whole became worse off. That's quite clear. But there were some relative winners, and they included people who owned businesses with pricing power, productive farmland, real estate, factories and equipment, commodities, and certain stocks. Another group that benefited were borrowers who paid a fixed rate of interest on their loans. So remember, lenders were big losers, but borrowers were big relative winners. Okay, so the winners I've shared so far make intuitive sense, I think, and might even be helpful in thinking about how you would want to protect your wealth if you become concerned with high inflation. The last group of winners I'm going to share is surprising, but not necessarily helpful in shaping your investment portfolio. And they were unionized workers. So coal miners, steel workers, factory workers, transportation workers, utility workers, construction workers, etc. The union bosses were able to negotiate wage increases fast enough to partially keep pace with inflation. Meanwhile, many of Germany's so-called middle-class professionals were devastated. Teachers, lawyers, doctors, bankers, engineers, architects, their salaries did not keep pace with inflation. In inflationary environments, pricing power matters immensely, whether you're talking about a worker, a business, or an investment portfolio. The ability to adjust income upwards matters much more than the appearance of stability on paper. So what does this mean for investors today? And I want to be careful here. I'm not suggesting that we're headed for German-style hyperinflation, but I do think the book highlights some things that are worthy of your attention. Persistent deficit spending and rising debt levels can contribute to inflationary pressures over long periods of time. And if inflation is structurally higher in the future, investors will want to be much more mindful of protecting their purchasing power. And publicly traded stocks have been one of the best long-term defenses against moderate inflation because businesses can raise prices, grow earnings, and generally just adapt over time. If you're a history buff and haven't yet dug into Weimar Germany, then I highly recommend this book. But outside of that, this is not a must-read for my clients. Now, for politicians, maybe, but they're too busy to be concerned with currency stability. All right, that's it. One book, one takeaway. Next month, we have The Second Mountain by David Brooks. All right, see you in July.